Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. My name is Breda Cullen and I am co-director of a company called HR Team. We provide HR and employment law services to organisations across Ireland, Northern Ireland and in the UK. And I suppose during these extremely challenging times, things have evolved quite a bit since March of this year, as I'm sure you well know, running businesses yourselves. So this morning's webinar is quite timely actually in light of the restrictions coming in at midnight tonight for the entire country. So I'm just going to touch on some of the common elements and challenges that employers have been dealing with over the last couple of months, but particularly what we really are predicting now for businesses over the course of the next 6 weeks. So looking at key processes such as temporary layoffs, short-time working, home working, and unfortunately some businesses are going to have to look at redundancies as well. Please feel free to ask questions. You can do so by hovering at the top of your screen and clicking on the chat button. So I will periodically throughout the webinar check the chat. I think it actually flags anyway. So if questions come up, I will answer them as I go along, and hopefully you find this information useful. Christina is also going to send a recording of the webinar so you can watch it back and you can watch the advice back. What I would say is that this webinar is specifically focused from an employer perspective and not an employee perspective, although you might find it helpful. So if you do require bespoke advice tailored to your particular situation, I would advise that you contact us after the webinar. For example, if you are having to look at redundancies or specific temporary layoffs in the coming weeks. So just to give you a background on HR Team, we were established in 2013. We have a full team of expert employment law, HR and safety consultants who are very experienced in their field. Our aim is to give employers peace of mind of having an expert on hand when that support is needed. So we're basically like your HR department, we're just not in the building. And you can be assured of a dedicated consultant who is fully qualified, highly experienced, and immediately on hand for a rapid response in person. So what will we be looking at this morning throughout the webinar? The key employment issues that we are faced with today in particular, as I'm sure you all know, the latest government guidelines and restrictions in Ireland. We will look briefly at temporary layoff and short-time working, the redundancy process, the challenges associated with staff who are working from home. And for those businesses who are still operational, for example, if you are an essential service provider, your COVID-19 safety strategy. So we'll give you some guidance around what control measures you should have in place in the workplace to ensure that your employees are protected and safeguarded and your business is protected as well. So what are the latest government guidelines? From midnight tonight, the country has gone into level 5. That means that the government is encouraging all people to work from home unless they are providing an essential service for which a physical presence is required. So there are obviously a number of essential services such as pharmacies, the public service such as hospitals and that sort of thing. There are a lot of businesses who are able to accommodate home working, and that is what the government has recommended as part of the level 5 tier. Essential retail and essential services will remain open, Bars, cafes, restaurants and wet pubs may provide takeaway and delivery service, but wet pubs in Dublin remain closed. Hotels, guest houses and B&Bs may remain open, but only to support provision to essential services. And museums, galleries and other cultural attractions will remain closed. So obviously there are a number of other factors associated with the level 5 restrictions, but I'm only focusing here from a business and employer point of view this morning. So a lot of employers, a lot of businesses will be faced with the challenge of what do I do now? What's next? How do I manage my staff? How do I ensure that I am legally compliant whilst doing so? How do I manage the mental health of my staff? How do I ensure that, you know, in 6 weeks' time, I can get my business up and running again? I suppose the key thing, and many of the questions that we've been receiving in the last 24 hours is, you know, how do I cut my costs immediately to ensure that my business can survive the next 6 weeks? So a lot of employers are looking at layoffs, short-time working, which is a reduced working week, home working if at all possible. Unfortunately, some businesses are having to cut their costs by making compulsory redundancies as well. So if we start with layoff and short-time working, and I'll firstly just explain what those mean. So a temporary layoff, and it is just that, it's a temporary measure. So whilst an employee is on temporary layoff, they remain an employee of your organisation. They're just not in the workplace. So this occurs where an employer is temporarily unable to provide an employee with the work for which they were employed. If your business has closed, or you are going to experience a shortage of work in the next 6 weeks or possibly beyond that, you can exercise temporary layoff. In normal circumstances, temporary layoff needs to be noted within the contract of employment explicitly to be able to exercise that. However, in these circumstances, if employers don't have a contract of employment, many employees will accept it anyway if it is an alternative to them losing their job altogether. Short-time working is slightly different. Again, it is a temporary measure, but it is a reduced working week. So some employers will be able to stay open. For example, in hospitality, if that takeaway service is being accommodated for, but you can no longer facilitate sit-ins, you may need a skeleton amount of staff, which means you can put certain staff on a reduced working week. So this is where an employee's hours of work or pay are reduced to less than 50% of the normal working week or weekly pay. It is very important to note that neither of the above measures are permanent. They are temporary measures. So just because you lay off a member of staff or reduce their working week, it doesn't mean to say that this is a permanent change to their terms. A layoff is not redundancy, it's a temporary measure, so they will remain an employee. The legislation does not specify notice periods as to when employees should be notified, and obviously the government have only 2 days ago announced the level 5 restrictions, so it won't be possible for a lot of employers to give that notice. However, in normal circumstances, it obviously is good practice to give some sort of notice, but it's not mandatory. There must be an explicit and agreed contract clause within the employee's contract to exercise the above. Now, as I said before, this temporary measure, many employees will agree to this if it means that they are retaining their job in the long term. In normal circumstances, temporary layoff and short-time working really should be noted within the contract of employment to exercise that. The emergency legislation is still currently in place until the 30th of November, and likely it will be extended beyond that. So the emergency legislation is a prevention measure in place for employers, whereby when an employee is either put in short-time working or a temporary layoff, before they could claim redundancy, if that temporary measure lasts for quite some time, more than 4 weeks. Now, employees will not be able to claim redundancy, and this is due to the Covid-19 emergency period. It is likely that that piece of legislation will be extended past the 30th of November. So what process should you follow when it comes to a temporary layoff? First of all, you need to ensure that there is a business rationale related to the decision, and clearly there is here. Focus on objective criteria such as business needs, skills, job roles, and qualifications. So we have been asked the question quite a lot, how do you actually choose? So some businesses who are remaining open are laying off some staff and holding on to other staff within the business. So it is very, very important that employers apply some sort of an objective criteria such as skills, job roles, qualifications, length of service, attendance. If you can apply objective data to that decision making, it will very much mitigate the risk of grievances, constructive dismissal claims, and potential discrimination claims as well. So whilst we are in very uncharted waters, the employment law that is there still remains. So if you have employees with protected characteristics such as a disability or a pregnancy, or one of the other 9 protected grounds under Irish legislation, it is very important that you proceed with caution and you apply the same procedure to all of your employees to ensure that that risk is very much mitigated. It is reasonable to distinguish between employees in terms of who you lay off and who you hold on to if that rationale is objective and you can stand over it. If your business is closing, you may need to lay off all your staff, and that's just something that you need to do. It's very important that you confirm all your decisions in writing, so document everything. If you're temporarily laying off some of your staff or all of your staff, it's very important that they do receive a letter from their employer to outline the date the layoff is effective from, the date you expect the business to reopen again, and any advice that you can give them in relation to the pandemic or unemployment payment, because employees may need to take that notification to the Department of Social Protection to obtain the relevant social welfare payments that they're entitled to. Reduced hours of work is also an option for employers, and many employers are reducing hours of work either via the short-time working method, again, which is temporary, or consultation. So some employers are indeed consulting with their staff to permanently reduce hours of work and to make a permanent change to employees' terms and conditions of employment. That is a possibility as well, and employers can indeed consider that. However, if it is going to be a permanent change to an employee's contract, then you must obtain the employee's agreement to that. Now, it's likely that if employees have that as an alternative to redundancy, that they will agree to that. In some cases they won't, in which case you may need to proceed with something like redundancy. But it is very important, again, to follow a process. So it's all about the process. Speak to your employees first, explain the changes you need to make, the reason for the change. Employee circumstances should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So it is very important to listen to your employees and any genuine concerns that they might have, and other alternatives can be considered, such as redeployment. So many employers are probably looking at this process and saying, I don't have time. There is no time to follow that process. As long as you follow this process up in writing. So if you have to call your employees in for a meeting, for example, today, then do that. And many employees will be expecting that. We get asked the question quite a bit about annual leave during short-time working and temporary layoffs. So within what's called the Organisation of Working Time Act, under the Irish legislation, employees only accrue annual leave for working time. So annual leave generally is not accrued during short-time working or temporary layoff. However, employers need to be aware of the 1365 rule. So the 1365 rule is if an employee has worked a minimum of 1,365 hours in the holiday leave year, then they will be entitled to 4 working weeks. So they might have worked those hours outside of the temporary layoff this year. I'm not so sure how realistic that would be, but they may well have worked that outside the temporary layoff, in which case they do need to get the 4 working weeks, or the 8% of their working hours. Employees will accrue public holidays for the first 13 weeks of temporary layoff. Okay, so as I said, we'll forward a copy of these slides and a recording of the webinar just so you can run your eye over that again. So I'm going to move on to redundancies and the process that is involved with redundancy. So for employers, there are 2 key elements to ensuring a legally compliant redundancy process. Number 1 is that there is a genuine rationale for redundancy. Now that might be that your business has had to close, that duties have significantly diminished as a result of, in this case, the pandemic. It could be that the location of work has changed. So there needs to be some sort of a justifiable business reason as to why the job role is not there. And redundancy takes the person out of it. So it's about the job role and not the person. The second thing employers need to be very aware of when conducting a redundancy process is a meaningful consultation. So 1 is your genuine rationale, 2 is your consultation. Now, even in these times, employers are absolutely required to follow that consultation process. You can carry out meetings via Zoom, via telephone, in light of the current circumstances, but it is very, very important that that consultation takes place. And that is whether you are making your entire workforce redundant or you are selecting specific employees for redundancy. In the first instance, what I would say is, unless you're sure that the role is permanently not needed in your business, you can continue with the temporary layoff or short-time working. Because the cost is fairly low for you at the minute. Yes, your employees will continue to accrue continuous service if they're on either temporary layoff or short-time working, but they're not accruing annual leave as such. They are accruing public holidays. So there is a small cost to that. But at the minute, if you're not sure as an employer what way your business is going to go, and that is completely understandable and completely normal, you can keep your staff on a temporary layoff or a reduced working week for now, until you see how things evolve over the coming weeks. So in the first instance, I would very much recommend that you do consider using either one of those temporary measures before considering a permanent redundancy. So the two key requirements are that there is genuine redundancy rationale, and that there's a meaningful consultation process carried out prior to making the final decision. So how does that consultation look? What does that look like? At the very minimum, what you need to be doing is any employee who is conducting a job role that you feel as the employer is at risk of redundancy. So for example, if you are running a restaurant, and you have 10 food and beverage assistants altogether employed, and you only need 5 of those roles, you would need to be putting all 10 staff at risk of redundancy in writing. That involves issuing a letter to all of those staff informing them that there is a possible redundancy situation, the reason as to why this is the case, the fact that you will be conducting a consultation process, and what criteria you will be using to score the employees at risk of redundancy, which will ultimately lead you to selecting a number of staff to be made redundant. That's the first stage. After that, then you need to be selecting some sort of criteria that you can use to pick who is made redundant. At that stage, you need to be inviting employees in for individual consultation meetings. And the purpose of those meetings is to outline the situation to the employees in person, to outline the rationale, to explain how many redundancies you're planning on making, and to consider any suggestions or alternatives that the employees wish to put forward themselves to avoid a redundancy situation. So whilst you don't have to grant any suggestions that employees make, you do have to be seen to consider them. That might be that they suggest a pay cut, reduction in hours, that they have skills in other areas within the business, or whatever it may be. So you may or may not be able to grant some of the things that they put forward, but you absolutely need to consider those. And redundancy really should be the last resort after you have considered everything. So there should be a number of consultation meetings before you actually get to that final decision. And then the employees who are ultimately made redundant must be given the opportunity to appeal that decision also. So a redundancy process, whilst it isn't about the person, it is about the job role. It is a method of dismissal. So ultimately, with the redundancy process, you will have employees who, in the eyes of the Workplace Relations Commission and the employee, obviously as well, are going to lose their livelihood. So it does come with risk for employers, and that risk is twofold. One is the unfair dismissal risk, and 2 is the discrimination risk if any of your employees are protected on the grounds of one of the 9 protected characteristics. So it's very, very important that employers still follow that procedure, even in the current circumstances where a lot of employees aren't actually in the workplace. So I have noted the process here: put the employees at risk of redundancy, consult with employees who are affected. If there are more individuals than jobs and you plan on keeping some staff, conduct a selection process using objective-based criteria. Examples of that criteria include experience, qualifications, length of service, and who is suitable to conduct the nature of the tasks. And consider if you need to apply a collective consultation also. You can seek volunteers if appropriate as well, and that might save you going down the compulsory redundancy route. So, you know, at your at-risk stage here, you can ask if any employees would like to be considered for voluntary redundancy. And, you know, if that is the case and someone does wish to apply for voluntary redundancy, it might help reduce the number of compulsory redundancies you have to make. It's a very, very difficult job, redundancies, for employers and for managers. So seeking volunteers can be a very good way of avoiding some of those extremely difficult conversations that you need to have. So that's redundancy. What I would say is, if you have any specific questions on redundancy, or you're thinking of going through that process as an employer, to seek specific and tailored advice on your situation, because every employer case is different. Every rationale might be different. Every set of circumstances of a workforce will be different. You might have different protected characteristics, different types of length of service within your business as well. So I would say that it is very, very important to seek specific advice on on your specific redundancy process, so that you can protect your business. So I just have a question in here. If redundancy is across the organisation, can departments set individual criteria for redundancy, or do those criteria have to be the same across the board? Okay, yeah, you can set separate criteria for different departments. You can absolutely do that, as long as you're applying the same criteria to the same group of job roles. So if you have an administration assistant if you have 5 administration assistants in one specific department, it's okay to apply criteria to those 5 administration assistants, as long as the same criteria is applied to all. If you have another department and you have 5 programming staff, for example, IT programmers, it's perfectly fine to set a separate set of criteria for that job role, as long as you apply that criteria to all 5. So that would be acceptable, as long as you can stand over the criteria that you have set and you have been consistent with the job role. Hopefully that answers your question. If there are any other questions on redundancy, feel free to ask them throughout the course of the webinar. So some organisations are and have for some time actually been implementing home working. Over the course of the last, well, since March really. And a lot of employees haven't actually gone into the workplace. But with home working, it can have its pros and cons. I'm sure a lot of you are working from home at the moment. It can be good because it removes the commute, for example. It can also be challenging for employees and for employers, and it's very important that employees don't become isolated when they're working from home. We're also faced with employers having to deal with various different mental health issues of staff because they are working from home and they're juggling family life, they're juggling kids and all sorts of things. So it is very important that employers are as proactive as possible whenever it comes to home working. So something that is really it should be a priority for employers just at the minute is ensuring a safe working environment. So if you have an employee who is working from home, you have to see it as if they're just working in the office. Their home has become their office. So to ensure that the employee doesn't suffer from back injuries or, whatever it may be, they could be working at the kitchen table, in their bedrooms, they could be working on a very small space. You do still need to ensure that it is a safe working environment to prevent any personal injury claims coming your way as an employer. And that might simply mean doing a remote risk assessment with your home workers, ensuring that there is a good chair provided for the employee, and a desk and a computer and whatever else is needed for the job. So ensuring a safe work environment is really, really important. Clarify pay arrangements. So obviously it's going to be full pay for home working. Clarify hours of work, start and finish times is really important as well. Provide the relevant equipment and materials. So if that's a phone and computer or whatever it may be. Clarify if telephone and internet costs will be reimbursed or be at the cost of the employee. Provide guidance on the security of information, data protection and confidentiality. So if an employee, they're obviously going to have access to either the cloud on their device, or they may have had to take hard copies of documentations home with them also. So it's very, very important that you have confidentiality and data protection guidelines outlined within your terms and conditions of employment. And have a home working agreement to clarify all of those terms and conditions. That's really, really important. And when I say a home working agreement, it might not necessarily be a specific agreement. It might be something that's built into their contract of employment. It might be a home working policy that's contained within your employee handbook. So ensure that there is absolute clarity there from the organisation in terms of what the expectations are from the employer in relation to home working. Another challenge employers have been faced with over the last number of months is, how do I keep my employees motivated when they are working from home? So regular communication is absolutely vital. Set a time each morning for this to take place, and it can be done in a group or individually. So for example, in our business, we have a weekly meeting on a Monday morning with everyone. And then we will touch base each and every morning then via either a video call on Zoom or a telephone call, to ensure that there's regular communication, that there's no duplication of tasks, but at the same time to ensure that nothing is missed as well. And it might only be 5 or 10 minutes, but that briefing is really, really important. And that is, I suppose that's one of the key elements of performance management for a manager or for an employer business owner, is to ensure that that regular communication takes place. It's really important as well that staff don't become isolated at home, and that can happen really, really easily. And it's so easy just to get stuck as a manager or an employer, I suppose, stuck in the daily grind of servicing or, getting back to clients, whatever it is that you're doing as part of your business. It's easy just to sit down and get started. But if you do have staff reporting into you, it's very, very important to keep that communication alive, and to be relentless about that. Ensure that employees are clear on the expectations of management and the organisation. There has never been a more important time for job descriptions. And when I say job descriptions, I don't mean a document that is gathering dust, and for many organisations that is the case, but a job description is very, very important at these times. So expectations can be outlined very, very clearly. Review your job descriptions on a regular basis. Now is a great time to do this. Set specific and measurable targets and review these regularly. Track productivity using the relevant systems. So this is a really good idea, particularly if you have employees who are to meet deadlines or targets or whatever it may be. Try to track productivity where you can to ensure that your business isn't suffering. And discuss progress with employees at the end of the day. Give feedback where you can. And I normally find that it's good to plan and protect that time with your team members. That is just as important as the daily grind core work, is to communicate with your employees and give them that feedback so they know exactly whether or not your expectations are being met and how they are progressing. And you can ask for an end of day report or summary of their progress and review the next morning. So obviously you're not going to micromanage your staff, but you can put those little basic tools in place that make a huge difference to the performance management of your staff during home working. The things I would say to outline clearly during home working, basic standards. I mean, you think that this is going to happen anyway, and unfortunately it doesn't. And so it is really, really important that if you have a code of conduct in your employee handbook, or you have a set of standards, or if you don't, make a list of basic standards that's important to your business and communicate those to staff. Timekeeping, be at your workstation at 9 o'clock if that's their start time. Mobile phone usage, it's very easy to pick up the phone and go on social media, particularly at this time when there is so much going on. Start and finish times, and being contactable during working hours, breaks, that sort of thing. For example, when I say breaks and working hours there, you might have a weekly planner. It could be something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, and you send it out to the team at the start of the week, and everybody knows then clearly who's on lunch at what time, if you need to have that sort of rota. Job description is very, very handy to have at this time, and targets, so KPIs and deadlines. Now this is obviously a whole other webinar, but performance management in general is very, very important at this time, even for those who are not home working. If you are still within the business, these three things are absolutely key in our eyes, and they are proven to be effective in performance managing your employees and motivating your employees as well, because there is clarity. So your basic standards, your expectations, and your targets, and we like to call it the BET system. So I'm going to move on briefly. Again, if there are any questions on home working, feel free to ask them. But I think it's quite important to touch on the COVID-19 safety strategy. Most businesses will have this in place, but it is something that needs to be reviewed on a very regular basis. If your business remains open, you will absolutely need to have a safety strategy in place. If your business is closed, and hopefully you will get open in 6 weeks' time, you will have to have the safety strategy in place then also. So the first thing that needs to be done, if it hasn't already taken place, and this is something that employers may have done months ago, but I will reiterate it, the employee induction training needs to take place. So all employees need to receive what's called COVID-19 awareness training. And this includes the latest up-to-date advice and guidance on public health, what a worker should do if they develop symptoms of COVID-19, details of how the physical workplace is organised to address the risk of COVID-19. So the 2 metre distance rule, where there are hand sanitisers, if you're staggering shifts or breaks or whatever that may be. So this is going to be different for every workplace. an outline of what the employer's COVID-19 response plan is. So are there self-isolation spaces? What happens if someone develops symptoms of COVID-19? The identification of points of contact from the employer and the workers. So every employer will need to have a COVID-19 appointed responsible person, and that person will need to have some form of training as well. And any other sector-specific advice that is relevant. So obviously, an office environment is going to be very different from a manufacturing environment. Workstations are going to be different, for example. So this training will need to be tailored in a bespoke way to every workplace. Now, if this is something that your organisation has not yet had, you do need to look into this immediately, and please do let us know if you need to organise that. The next thing that needs done is a COVID-19 safety statement. So again, that is a legal requirement. A risk assessment of the premises will need to be done to ensure that that employees can safely social distance, that there's sanitisation facilities available, and that all the control measures that need to be taken are being taken. A standard operational procedure for COVID-19, a compliance officer needs to be appointed. If you do not have these measures in place, contact Safe Team today, who will assist you. So just let me know if you don't have these things in place, and we will get you sorted with that straight away. Something else that needs to be done that's not there is a self-declaration form. So employees will need to fill in what's called a self-declaration form. So if you are closing now for a period of time, and you have your employees coming back on the 1st of December, you will need employees to fill in a self-declaration form to outline if they have had any symptoms, if they suffer from an underlying medical condition that you need to be aware of, if they're pregnant, although that's not now in the high risk category, who their next of kin is, that sort of thing. So that's really important that is done on a regular basis. My email address is there as well, so it's Breda at hrteamservices.com. Let's check the time. So I'm just going to go through a few frequently asked questions before we finish up on the webinar, and these are just a few basic questions that we have received over, I suppose, over the course of the last number of weeks and months. So many employees will need to self-isolate, and you can see the numbers in Ireland for yourself on a daily basis. They are increasing, and many employees are having to self-isolate because they've either contracted the virus or they have been a close contact of a positive case. So in that case, employees are not by law entitled to sick pay unless their contract of employment states so. So check your contracts of employment. If there is sick pay in there, you will need to exercise that. If there is not, then employees can obtain the COVID illness benefit from the Department of Social Protection. It is important to ensure that your employees, particularly if they've been a positive case, that they have completed the full relevant self-isolation period prior to returning to work. And how you find out that information is from public health guidelines. So there are a number of different scenarios in terms of self-isolation, how long that's supposed to be, whether they've been a close contact or a positive case themselves. That all needs to be advised by the public health authorities. So you should seek advice as an employer from the public health authorities, and you should find out as much information from the employee as well. You can check in on your employees if they are off self-isolating. You might have employees who are extremely frustrated because they have had to self-isolate, and maybe they tested negative, but they still have to self-isolate. You can check in on your employees' health by phone or email during their absence from work. It's important, you know, that they are given that time though to self-isolate if they have been advised to do so. There are other types of leave being implemented as well. So, you know, if you don't have sick pay, you know, you might agree at your discretion with your employee that they can use some of their annual leave, some of their toil, whatever it may be. So, so you can look at that. And it is very important to keep your policies under review and to communicate clearly those changes. So it's very important that you do have at this time a COVID-19 policy. So many employers wonder, can they ask their employees to take annual leave at a set time? So you can do that. You can require employees to take their annual leave as long as you take into account their family responsibilities, opportunities for rest and recreation, and you consult with the employees at least 1 month in advance. Now that will not always be possible, and you may have employees who are more than happy to take their annual leave because it's coming to the end of the year, they might lose it anyway, and it means that they do continue to receive full pay. So it is definitely an option. You can also facilitate requests from employees to take annual leave to care for a dependent or a child. Now, obviously, we don't have school closures this time around, but in certain schools, classes have been sent home because there's a positive case in the class or whatever it may be. So, so we do have all different types of scenarios. Many employers are considering using up annual leave at this present time, and if you do wish to enforce this, then you can. You can, as long as you're as fair as possible to staff and you're giving them as much notice as you possibly can. So a parent has had to self-isolate due to the child being off sick. Can force majeure now be used in these cases? Force majeure leave is covered by legislation for an absolute emergency. So in normal circumstances, force majeure leave is used where there is an emergency at very, very short notice and the employee needs to get up and leave the workplace. This is something that the employer and employee should agree between them. Can force majeure leave be used in these cases? If I was an employer in that case, I would say yes, it could. If the employer is agreeable to that. The only shortfall with that is it will set a precedent within your organization. So if you have one employee who has had to self-isolate and you permit them to use force majeure leave, and they can get 5 days in total in a period of 36 months, 3 days in 12 months, you will probably have to approve the next employee that comes along and looks to use force majeure leave as well. Do you have to approve force majeure leave? You don't, as long as you apply that procedure consistently. So what I would say is, if you are going to approve force majeure leave, and the employee can take 3 paid days in the year or 5 paid days in 36 months, then you will probably have to do it for every parent or every person that has to self-isolate as a result of COVID. What do I do if an employee does not wish to attend work because they're concerned for their safety? Yeah, we've been faced with a lot of questions like this, particularly actually in the last 24 hours, because the pandemic unemployment payment has been appealing for some members of staff. And of course, there are genuine circumstances where employees are concerned for their safety and they do not want to attend the workplace. What I would say is, if your employees have concerns in relation to their safety by coming to work, then you have to listen to their concerns. You have to try and address them where you can. At the end of the day, if you have work available for a member of staff and they're still not wanting to come into work, then I would suggest that you allow them to take some sort of leave. Now, there are a number of factors to consider there. If the government has not placed any restrictions on your sector, so if you are in the construction sector, the manufacturing sector, any of those essential businesses that remain open, then there is nothing to say that that person cannot come into work, as long as you have your COVID safety strategy in place, so all your control measures to protect your employees, and you have work available for your staff. If an employee is concerned for their safety because they are in the high risk category, so they have an underlying medical condition, that is definitely something that you would need to consider. You could consider an alternative arrangement such as remote working, and if that's not possible, you would be better to put them on a temporary layoff so that they can obtain the pandemic unemployment payment. If an employee lives with an employee in the high risk category and they're concerned about bringing it back to the house, again, consider remote working, or you can look at a layoff. Alternatively, if they can work alone or safely social distance, it's reasonable to ask them to return to work. If an employee is not in the high risk category and does not live with someone in the high risk category, if you have all your control measures in place, but they still do not wish to return to work and you can't see any valid reason why they won't, all you can do is assure them of the appropriate control measures, assure them of strict social distancing and hygiene rules, provide the training and the management commitment. In any case, your safety strategy is pivotal to protect your business. It is an absolute last resort to consider disciplinary action, but you can consider disciplinary action as well if you feel you've put everything in place and the employee does not come to work. That is a last resort, but it is a possibility. What if an employee refuses to come to work altogether? So speak with this employee first, ascertain the facts, find out what their concerns are, reiterate your company's safety strategy. And again, I can't stress enough just how important your safety measures are to demonstrate your commitment to their health and safety. Consider a type of leave such as annual leave or unpaid leave, and communication is of the utmost importance. Consistency is also really important as well. So it goes back to that previous question there, can you apply force majeure leave? Yeah, you can, but one rule should not differ to another for the same scenario. And that's really, really important. There's no legal or statutory right to pay if they refuse to come to work without a medical recommendation. And you can consider disciplinary action for unauthorised absence. However, this should be the last resort, and you need to really establish all of the facts of that set of circumstances before you consider disciplinary action. Many employers have been concerned that their employees are maybe not well enough to be back in work. It's really important to ensure that they complete the self-declaration form at least 3 days in advance of their return to work. You can also have temperature checks, and many employers have put that in place months ago. And there's many providers and suppliers where you can get temperature checks. It's definitely something you can look at. You may wish to conduct one-to-one meetings with employees subject to social distancing, or you can do them in Zoom to discuss any illness they have experienced. And you can ask employees to provide evidence that they're well enough to be back in work. So some employers, for example, have asked for a copy of the text message that they received from the public health authorities regarding, for example, a negative COVID test and the date that was negative to ensure that they've completed the self-isolation period. You could consider health screening, and again, in any case, the safety strategy is really important. Always be mindful of any employee with a disability, an underlying medical condition, or pregnancy. Just the final couple of questions. I found some of my employees not social distancing. What do I do? And this has been a question that has come up actually over the course of the last few months. Employees, there are employees who maybe, you know, don't believe that we have to implement these control measures, and that's something for employers to be aware of as well, that it is really important to reiterate the social distancing rules and refer employees to the policy, inform employees that they may be subject to the disciplinary procedure if they don't adhere to the policy. You can consider a notification of concern or a letter of concern on their file, which is at the preliminary stage to disciplinary action. And from a wider perspective, ensure that all employees have signed off on their training. So just to remind you of the government subsidies that are in place. So the employment wage subsidy scheme is still in place. The pandemic unemployment payment, both of those are based on weekly earnings of employees, and the enhanced illness benefit because of COVID-19 absences is still in place as well. So what do you do next? Review where your business is positioned in terms of level 5 restrictions. So if you need to close, ensure that your temporary layoffs are notified in writing and continue to communicate with your staff throughout. If you remain open, ensure you have your robust safety strategy in place. If you need to reduce your employees' hours, you need to communicate this clearly in a short time working letter. If you're making redundancies, you need to ensure you follow a consultation process. If you have employees working from home, you need to ensure that there's clarity on your home working policy. And that, I suppose, that is it in a nutshell. That is the different type of scenarios that you may be up against. What I would say is to obtain bespoke advice, particularly if you're going down the redundancy process. Christina will send these slides out also. So we have a number of further complimentary webinars between now and the end of the year. Our next webinar is 5th of November, and it's a briefing for Northern Ireland. We have a further briefing for Ireland, which will probably apply to most of you guys. And that's on the 19th of November. The 3rd of December, we have how to manage employee motivation and mental health during home working. And the 17th of December, we have a more detailed webinar on the actual redundancy process. And you can visit our website there. It is www.hrteamservices.com. You can also send me an email if you have any specific questions or you require bespoke advice. And my email address is Breda, B-R-E-D-A, @hrteamservices.com.